The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in early 1943 presented a grim reality for American carrier aviators as they prepared for sorties. The statistical data, openly acknowledged, painted a stark picture of attrition. For every adversary aircraft dispatched, the United States suffered the loss of nearly one of its own. In certain aerial confrontations, this disproportionate ratio escalated to an even more alarming degree. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a venerable workhorse of naval aviation since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, proved particularly vulnerable in vertical engagements. Pilots, acutely aware of the perils awaiting them at higher altitudes, frequently composed farewell letters to their loved ones before embarking on missions. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, a formidable opponent, possessed an unparalleled ability to ascend, outclimbing any aircraft the United States Navy could deploy. When Japanese pilots detected American formations, their strategy eschewed horizontal engagement. Instead, they would initiate a rapid climb, knowing that once they had achieved a superior altitude in their Zeros, the fate of the American pilots was effectively sealed. The issue at hand was not a deficiency in valor. American naval aviators possessed an abundance of courage. Rather, the fundamental challenge lay in the immutable laws of physics. The Zero, with an empty weight of 5,300 pounds, was considerably lighter than the Wildcat, which tipped the scales at 5,800 pounds and was equipped with less potent engines. In a direct climbing contest, the Zero could ascend at an impressive rate of 3,100 feet per minute within its optimal performance parameters, while the Wildcat struggled to exceed 2,300 feet per minute. This critical disparity of 800 feet per minute rapidly transformed into a lethal advantage for the Japanese within a mere 90 seconds of initial contact. Japanese aviators ruthlessly exploited this inherent advantage in every encounter. Upon sighting an American formation at 12,000 feet, they would propel their Zeros into a swift climb, positioning themselves at 15,000 or even 16,000 feet before the American pilots could effectively respond. From this commanding height, they would execute a diving attack, utilizing the sun's glare to their advantage, and unleash their devastating 20mm cannons through the American formation before the Wildcats could maneuver to counter. By the time the American pilots attempted to retaliate by climbing, the Zeros had already regained their superior altitude, often 3,000 feet above, their energy restored and ready to initiate another punishing pass. Pilots recounted this recurring nightmare over Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and every contested stretch of ocean between Hawaii and the Philippines. The glint of enemy aircraft would appear, throttles would be pushed forward, and the Wildcat would strain for altitude, its altimeter needle creeping upwards with agonizing slowness, as if moving through a viscous fluid. The Zeros, meanwhile, would vanish, not in retreat, but in a relentless climb to re-establish their dominant position. We hope you're enjoying this deep dive into the historical realities of aerial combat. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video for more insights. We would be incredibly grateful for your like and subscription. Also, please take a moment to leave a comment below, telling us where you're from and what you think about this critical topic in aviation history. A number of American pilots, driven by desperation, attempted to follow the Zeros into their vertical ascent. The vast majority of these pilots never returned. The few who survived recounted the harrowing experience of watching their airspeed dissipate as they pitched their aircraft upward, the flight controls becoming unresponsive and mushy, and the airframe shuddering with the ominous vibrations of a stall warning. Simultaneously, tracer rounds would begin to streak upwards from below, signifying that another Zero had maneuvered into a vulnerable position beneath their tail during their ill-fated climbing attempt. It became unequivocally clear that victory could not be achieved through vertical maneuvers. The Zero was the undisputed master of vertical airspace. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a brilliant tactician, devised a partial solution in 1942 with his innovative weave maneuver. This tactic involved pairs of fighter aircraft scissoring back and forth, effectively covering each other's vulnerable tails. This defensive strategy undeniably saved lives, affording Wildcat pilots a fighting chance in horizontal engagements. However, the Thatch weave was fundamentally a defensive doctrine, a survival tactic, rather than an offensive solution. It did not address the critical altitude disadvantage, nor did it prevent Japanese pilots from exploiting their climbing superiority to set up devastating ambushes from the sun. While engaging in the weave at 10,000 feet might provide some protection, the presence of 6 Zeros at 18,000 feet, positioned directly with the sun behind them, still portended an extremely perilous situation. The weave could help pilots endure the initial pass, and perhaps even a second. But with every defensive turn, precious energy was expended, while the Zeros would simply climb back to altitude and reset for another attack. They possessed the luxury of time and altitude, thereby dictating the terms of engagement. Squadron commanders submitted after-action reports that read like grim chronicles of aerial horror. Repeatedly, phrases such as engaged 12 enemy fighters at air weight 47 hours. Lost 5 aircraft. Enemy casualties, 2 probable, 1 confirmed. Enemy fighters climbed away and refused further engagement on our terms appeared. The recurring phrase, refused further engagement on our terms, was highly significant. It did not imply that the Japanese were disengaging out of fear. Rather, they were executing a tactical climb, repositioning themselves to exploit their inherent advantage. They leveraged the one capability that American fighters could not effectively counter in 1943, systematically decimating highly trained pilots at a rate faster than the flight school in Pensacola could replace them. The Thatch weave was adopted as standard doctrine across every carrier air group by mid-1942, and within its specific limitations, it proved genuinely effective. When 2 Wildcats executed the weave flawlessly, they established a mutual defense pattern that was exceedingly difficult for a Zero to penetrate without incurring damage. However, the inherent problem emerged when one critically examined the actual accomplishments of the weave. It was a strategy for survival, not for victory. Analysts within the Fleet Air Arm at Pearl Harbor meticulously compiled engagement reports throughout the latter half of 1942, revealing an undeniable pattern. American pilots who employed the Thatch weave experienced dramatically higher survival rates in encounters compared to those who did not. Yet survival and outright victory represented distinct outcomes. The weave fundamentally traded offensive killing power for enhanced staying power. A typical engagement over the Solomon Islands in late 1942 provides a clear illustration. 4 Wildcats, operating in 2 weaving pairs, encountered 6 Zeros at 14,000 feet. The American pilots executed their scissoring pattern with perfect precision. The Zeros initiated their initial diving pass, but the weave compelled them to break off their attack without achieving any kills. This was because every time a Zero committed to attacking 1 Wildcat, That pilot's wingman was simultaneously maneuvering into a prime firing position. It was a masterclass in defensive aerial maneuvering. However, the Zeros would then climb away, and the Wildcats, in an attempt to pursue, would confront the reassertion of the fundamental physics problem with a vengeance. To maintain the integrity of the weave, both aircraft were required to coordinate their turns with precision. Every turn resulted in a dissipation of energy. Each cycle of the weave cost the aircraft approximately 40 knots of airspeed and 800 feet of altitude. Pilots were deliberately sacrificing their climb performance to sustain mutual support. Simultaneously, the Zeros, now operating independently, channeled all their energy into a rapid vertical ascent. 3 minutes later, they would be back at 18,000 feet, while the Wildcats struggled to reach 13,000 feet and were 90 knots slower than when the engagement had commenced. Commander Thatch himself acknowledged this crucial limitation in a briefing delivered to carrier squadron leaders in February 1943. His precise words, meticulously documented in the training minutes, were, "The weave gives our boys the defensive edge they need to survive the first encounter. It does not give them the offensive capability to pursue and destroy a climbing enemy." He was not criticizing his own tactical innovation. Rather, he was clearly delineating its operational boundaries. The weave represented a significant breakthrough in defensive fighter doctrine, but it was inherently reactive. Pilots were responding to Japanese attacks, not dictating the terms of engagement. The Zero pilots retained the initiative, deciding when to engage and when to disengage, because they could always climb away faster than the American fighters could follow, while maintaining their defensive formation. Some more aggressive American pilots attempted to abandon the weave in order to chase climbing Zeros. The resulting loss rates for these desperate attempts were catastrophic. A pilot would break away from their wingman, push the throttle to full power, and pitch up in pursuit of a climbing Zero. For perhaps 45 seconds, there might be a fleeting sensation of gaining ground, with the gun sight tracking the enemy. Then, the airspeed would plummet below 180 knots. The controls would become heavy and unresponsive, and the rate of climb would deteriorate from merely inadequate to utterly pathetic. The Zero being pursued, meanwhile, would continue its upward acceleration at an even steeper angle. Worse still, the pilot had separated from their wingman, thereby forfeiting the critical mutual support. Other Zeros in the vicinity would spot the lone Wildcat in a slow climb, a state of maximum vulnerability. They would position themselves above and behind, and the first terrifying indication of their presence would be 7.7mm rounds piercing the armor plate. If fortunate, the pilot would recognize the immediate danger quickly enough to push the nose down and execute a desperate dive away. If not, squadron mates would witness the aircraft trailing smoke and fire as it arced into the vast expanse of the ocean. The mathematical realities were unforgiving. In a coordinated weave, Wildcat pairs achieved approximately 1.3 kills per loss against Zeros. This was survivable, but barely sustainable in the long term. Individual Wildcats attempting to pursue climbing Zeros, however, achieved a devastating 0.4 kills per loss, an utterly catastrophic ratio. The doctrine essentially wrote itself, stay in the weave, but understand that you cannot chase them into altitude. Your primary focus must be on protecting the bombers and ensuring your own survival to land back on the carrier. This represented sound tactical thinking given the severe equipment constraints, but it left American fighter pilots feeling profoundly helpless. They were compelled to fly defensively in what was inherently an offensive war. Every engagement concluded in the same frustrating manner. They survived, the Zeros climbed away, and the following day, the enemy would return with their decisive altitude advantage. It was impossible to win a war of attrition when the adversary dictated both the commencement and conclusion of every engagement. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat began arriving in Pacific carrier squadrons during May 1943, and the initial reactions from pilots were a mixture of enthusiastic anticipation and cautious optimism. This new aircraft was an absolute behemoth compared to the Wildcat. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine generated a formidable 2,000 horsepower, almost double the output of the Wildcat's power plant. While the Hellcat was heavier, with an empty weight of 9,060 pounds, that immensely powerful engine compensated for the increased mass with undeniable authority. Its maximum speed surged to 380 mph, and its rate of climb improved dramatically to 3,500 feet per minute under optimal conditions. On paper, the Hellcat either matched or surpassed the Zero in nearly every critical performance category. Pilots who climbed into the cockpits of Hellcats for the very first time immediately sensed the profound difference. The acceleration was described as violent, and the rate of climb was intoxicating. Finally, an American carrier fighter that did not feel like an inherent disadvantage the moment enemy aircraft were sighted. The USS Essex launched the inaugural combat mission for the Hellcat on August 31, 1943, during a series of strikes against Marcus Island. The initial results were highly promising. 2 Zeros were destroyed, with no Hellcat losses, though it was noted that this particular engagement did not involve extensive high-altitude maneuvering. The combat primarily occurred between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, characterized mostly by horizontal scissors maneuvers and deflection shooting. The Hellcat's superior speed and formidable firepower truly excelled under these conditions. Its 6 .50 caliber machine guns delivered a devastating volume of fire, and the robust airframe could absorb punishment that would have utterly shredded a Zero. Pilots returned to the Essex reporting a genuine sense of confidence for the first time in the war, believing that this aircraft could genuinely engage Zeros on equal terms. Squadron commanders submitted optimistic action reports, concluding that the Hellcat was indeed the long-awaited answer to their aerial challenges. As aerial combat shifted to higher altitudes, the inherent limitations of the Hellcat aircraft became apparent. During confrontations above Rabaul in October 1943, pilots operating Hellcats frequently engaged seasoned Zero pilots. These adversaries consistently employed their established and effective strategy, a rapid ascent, while Hellcats demonstrated an improved ability to maintain proximity to the climbing Zeros compared to their Wildcat predecessors, proving their genuine 3,500 feet per minute climb rate. Veteran Japanese aviators, adept in energy management, still managed to achieve superior altitudes more swiftly. An expertly handled Zero could sustain an impressive climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute, while simultaneously preserving its agility. In contrast, the Hellcat's peak climb performance was contingent upon a very precise flight envelope, necessitating specific throttle positions, precise pitch angles, and particular airspeeds. Any departure from these optimal parameters would result in a swift and significant reduction in its climbing capability. Furthermore, the Hellcat's greater mass, approximately 400 pounds heavier than the Zero, paradoxically hindered its performance during extended vertical maneuvers. Although it could initially match the Zero's ascent, sustaining that climb while simultaneously attempting to achieve a firing position, expended energy at a much quicker rate than the lighter Japanese fighter. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, a pilot from VF-9 Squadron, articulated this persistent challenge in his debriefing report from November 1943. He noted that while a Hellcat could theoretically match a Zero's climb if flown flawlessly, and if the Zero pilot committed errors, against proficient Japanese aviators intimately familiar with their aircraft's capabilities, the altitude advantage still consistently favored the enemy. Valencia acknowledged that this disparity was less pronounced than the significant gap previously experienced with Wildcats, but he emphasized its undeniable reality. He grimly concluded that once Zeros ascended above 20,000 feet, with the sun positioned at their rear, American pilots were invariably forced into a defensive posture. As one of the Navy's most astute tactical thinkers, Valencia's analysis pinpointed the crux of the problem. The Hellcat, despite its advancements, merely reduced the performance discrepancy. It did not eradicate the fundamental issue of the Zero's superior vertical energy advantage. We invite you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this insightful video. Your support, through a like and subscription, would be greatly appreciated. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from, and your thoughts on the compelling topic discussed in this presentation. Throughout the latter half of 1943, fighter pilots engaged in various experimental tactical approaches to counter this aerial supremacy. Some attempted aggressive climbing pursuits the instant they sighted enemy Zeros, operating under the assumption that the Hellcat's sheer engine power would overwhelm the initial altitude disadvantage. The outcomes of these endeavors were inconsistent. While this strategy proved moderately effective against less experienced Japanese pilots, it consistently proved to be a perilous trap when confronting veterans. Engaging in such a vertical chase inevitably led to rapid fuel and energy consumption for the Hellcat. The seasoned Zero pilot, understanding this dynamic, would simply adjust his climb angle to preserve separation. Within a mere 20 seconds, both aircraft might find themselves at 18,000 feet. Yet the Zero would invariably be 2,000 feet higher, perfectly positioned to initiate a devastating diving attack, while the Hellcat remained slow and exposed. Certain pilots also experimented with a modified version of the thatch weave while flying Hellcats. This maneuver, owing to the Hellcat's superior speed, yielded better results than it had with Wildcats, yet it fundamentally remained a defensive tactic. It inherently allowed the Japanese pilots to dictate the vertical dynamics of the engagement. Undeniably, the Hellcat represented a significant advancement in aerial warfare technology. Indeed, kill ratios in horizontal dogfights shifted decisively in favor of American forces, approaching an impressive 4.1 during the concluding months of 1943. Nevertheless, the persistent challenge of altitude advantage remained unresolved. Japanese pilots, adept at vertical energy combat, continued to maneuver Hellcats into tactically disadvantageous positions. It became increasingly clear that the ultimate resolution lay not in further enhancing the aircraft's inherent performance specifications, which were already optimized, but rather in fundamentally reevaluating and refining the way pilots employed the Hellcat's existing capabilities. By late 1943, this critical understanding had yet to be fully grasped by operational commanders. In February 1944, Commander David McCampbell assumed leadership of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex, introducing a doctrinal emphasis on altitude that his pilots initially perceived as overly stringent. McCampbell possessed no interest in merely making minor adjustments to established combat procedures. Having meticulously analyzed every engagement report spanning the preceding 18 months, he had discerned a critical pattern that had eluded the majority of his fellow commanders. He observed that American pilots consistently strove for altitude equality with Japanese aircraft, climbing to match the enemy's height before initiating combat. McCampbell vehemently argued that this approach was fundamentally flawed. His philosophy dictated that one should not merely ascend to the enemy's level, but rather initiate combat from an altitude that the adversary could not effectively challenge. The true tactical advantage, he asserted, was not found in achieving parity in height, but in dominating the vertical dimension where the sun's glare rendered one virtually undetectable. Consequently, his pilots commenced a radically different training regimen in March 1944. Conventional carrier air patrol doctrine typically positioned fighter aircraft within the 12,000 to 15,000 foot altitude band, a height considered adequate for timely threat detection, while also conserving precious fuel. McCampbell, however, mandated that his fighters maintain an orbit at a minimum of 20,000 feet, and ideally at 25,000 feet, whenever operational conditions permitted. Crucially, he insisted that they strategically position themselves directly between the sun and the anticipated direction of enemy approach. This was not a general orientation towards the sun, but a precise alignment, ensuring that any adversary attempting to visually locate them from below would be forced to gaze directly into the blinding solar glare. Initially, his squadron leaders voiced objections, highlighting that sustained operations at 25,000 feet consumed fuel at an accelerated rate. The extreme cold caused pilot discomfort, and the overall conditions were arduous. Yet, McCampbell remained indifferent to matters of comfort. His primary concern was the immutable principles of physics and the inherent limitations of human physiology. From an altitude of 25,000 feet, with the sun positioned at a 45-degree angle directly astern, an aircraft becomes virtually undetectable to any pilot attempting a visual search from below. The human eye struggles to differentiate the silhouette of an aircraft against the brilliant backdrop of the solar disk. By the time an adversary might even begin to register a presence, the attacking aircraft would already be hurtling downwards through 20,000 feet, having accumulated an impressive 450 miles per hour of kinetic energy. The inaugural successful implementation of this innovative strategy occurred on March 30th, 1944, during aerial operations targeting Palau. Air Group 15 dispatched a fighter sweep mission, with its pilots receiving explicit directives: ascend to 24,000 feet, position themselves with the sun at their 7 roars high, and patiently await the ascent of Japanese interceptors into their designated engagement zone. A formation of 18 Hellcats then maintained this high-altitude orbit for a period of 23 minutes. Japanese radar systems successfully detected the approaching American strike package, prompting the immediate launch of 16 Zero fighters from Peleliu Airfield. As anticipated, these Zeros ascended aggressively to initiate an interception. Upon reaching 18,000 feet, they continued their climb, diligently searching for the American fighters that radar intelligence had indicated were within the vicinity. The Zero pilots meticulously scanned the sky, checking their rear sectors and diligently clearing the airspace above them, executing every procedure precisely as dictated by their rigorous training. Yet, they remained entirely oblivious to the presence of the Hellcats until the initial devastating diving attack ripped through their formation. Commander McCampbell personally spearheaded this surprise assault, leading his division as they plunged from 24,000 feet at a near-vertical trajectory, rapidly accelerating to 420 miles per hour. The Hellcats streaked through the Zero formation with the speed and intensity of meteors. McCampbell's opening burst of fire obliterated the wing route of a Zero at 19,000 feet. The unfortunate Japanese pilot exhibited no reaction and initiated no evasive maneuvers simply because he was utterly unaware of the impending danger. The entirety of this decisive aerial engagement transpired in a mere 90 seconds. The outcome was stark. 7 Zeros were annihilated, with an additional 3 damaged and forced to retreat, while American forces sustained no losses whatsoever. The surviving Japanese fighters rapidly dispersed, plummeting towards sea level and abandoning any further attempts to re-engage in the battle. They were utterly incapable of ascending towards an adversary they could not perceive. McCampbell's subsequent after-action report was remarkably concise and factual. Enemy aircraft demonstrated no awareness of our presence until weapon impact. Solar positioning provided complete tactical surprise, despite clear weather conditions. Initially, other squadron commanders perused McCampbell's account with a degree of skepticism. 7 kills in a minute and a half seemed an improbable exaggeration. However, the undeniable evidence from the gun camera footage left no room for doubt. Frame after frame depicted Zero pilots maintaining steady, unwavering flight paths right up to the precise instant that 50 caliber rounds began to impact their airframes. There were no defensive breaks, no evasive maneuvers, no indication of awareness whatsoever. They were, quite literally, flying blind because their standard visual search protocols necessitated looking upwards into the sun's quadrant to identify potential threats, a task that human eyes are fundamentally incapable of accomplishing effectively above 15,000 feet. At such altitudes and angles, the delicate photoreceptors within the human retina are completely inundated by the intense solar radiation. While the brain may receive some sensory input, it becomes utterly incapable of processing distinct shapes or discerning movement against the overwhelming glare. The Zero pilots, despite their earnest attempts to locate the Hellcats, found their eyes physically unable to execute this critical task. Within a single week, news of this groundbreaking strategy disseminated rapidly throughout the carrier task force. McCampbell's innovative tactic was no longer a theoretical concept, it was a demonstrably proven method. The core principles were clear: dominate the altitude, command the sun's position, and patiently await the enemy's ascent into a pre-established kill zone. The Japanese forces were inherently unable to devise an effective countermeasure, as any such response would necessitate visual contact with an adversary their optical systems simply could not perceive. Consequently, the Zero's vaunted climb rate advantage was rendered entirely inconsequential. They could ascend as swiftly as their aircraft allowed, only to climb unknowingly into a lethal zone from which they had no visual escape. While the human eye stands as an extraordinary sensory apparatus, its functionality is strictly bound by immutable physical constraints that no amount of training or sheer willpower can transcend. At sea level, under clear daytime conditions, the eyes typically adapt to approximately 10,000 lux of ambient light. In response, the pupils naturally constrict, and the photoreceptor cells adjust their sensitivity, enabling the perception of shapes, movement, and intricate details with remarkable clarity. However, direct sunlight at ground level delivers a staggering 120,000 lux of illumination. Gazing directly at the sun, even for an ephemeral moment, causes the retinal cells to become completely saturated and overwhelmed. The rhodopsin pigment within the rod cells undergoes a bleaching process, while the cone cells, vital for discerning fine detail and color, effectively cease function to avert permanent damage. The brain then interprets this intense input as an incandescent glare, devoid of any discernible detail or resolution. This biological safeguard, inherent in human physiology, actively prevents prolonged direct observation of the sun, thereby protecting one's precious vision. Now consider the exacerbation of this very issue at an altitude of 20,000 feet. The atmospheric filtering effect diminishes significantly with increasing elevation. At 20,000 feet, the intensity of solar radiation escalates by approximately 30% when compared to sea level, a direct consequence of the reduced atmospheric mass available to absorb and scatter incoming light. Consequently, the 120,000 lux experienced at ground level transforms into an even more formidable 156,000 lux. The resultant glare intensifies dramatically, prompting further pupil constriction and often leading to involuntary lacrimation. But for combat aviators, the most critical consequence is the catastrophic collapse of contrast sensitivity. Contrast sensitivity denotes the eye's inherent capacity to differentiate an object from its surrounding background. Under typical ground-level conditions, the human eye can discern contrast variations as minute as 2%. However, at high altitudes and when gazing anywhere in the proximity of the sun, this crucial sensitivity degrades precipitously, plummeting to 15% or even lower. Thus, a Zero's dark blue-gray camouflage, when silhouetted against the brilliant sky, becomes virtually indistinguishable and effectively invisible if positioned anywhere within a 40-degree conical sector, radiating from the solar disk. The strategic placement relative to the solar disk proved to be a critical factor in aerial combat. Japanese aviators in 1944 fully recognized the imperative to meticulously scan the airspace above them for potential aggressors. Their rigorous training emphasized regularly checking their 6 o'clock high position. However, this regimen failed to account for the inherent physiological limitations that render effective visual reconnaissance within the sun's direct quadrant at elevated altitudes an impossibility. When a Zero pilot, flying at an elevation of 16,000 feet, attempted to scrutinize the sky directly above, with the sun glaring from his 11 o'clock high, his ocular system was physically incapable of discerning any discernible visual intelligence in that specific area. All that registered was an overwhelming, blinding white luminosity. In such circumstances, he might perhaps perceive fleeting impressions of darker, undefined shapes. Yet he remained utterly unable to differentiate whether these enigmatic patches constituted genuine cloud formations, mere optical distortions resulting from his overstrained retinas, or, most critically, 4 enemy Hellcats skillfully maneuvering for an imminent dive attack. His cerebral cortex was, in essence, receiving corrupted and unreliable visual input. While a vague premonition of an adversary's presence might flicker through his mind, mere suspicion was wholly insufficient to furnish the precise targeting data he desperately required. Critical metrics, such as the enemy's range, bearing, exact altitude, or the precise number of hostile aircraft. Conversely, the Hellcat pilots who expertly capitalized on this tactical advantage were subject to the very same biological constraints. However, they had masterfully positioned themselves such that these inherent limitations worked decisively in their favor rather than against them. When one is situated at an elevation of 24,000 feet, with the adversary below at 17,000 feet, the gaze is directed downwards. The sun, in this advantageous configuration, resides behind and above the attacker, precluding any direct, blinding glare. The enemy aircraft below, starkly contrasted against the deeper hues of the ocean or the island terrain, are clearly silhouetted. The attacker's contrast sensitivity remains unimpaired, functioning optimally. This permits the Hellcat pilot to accurately count the opposing aircraft, meticulously assess their formations, deliberately select a specific target, and confidently initiate an assault, all while the enemy remains engaged in a futile upward search into the incapacitating glare, desperately striving to pinpoint the attackers. The Hellcat pilots possess comprehensive intelligence. Their adversaries possess none. This profound informational disparity proved to be a more decisive advantage than raw speed, a superior climb rate, or any other performance metric detailed within the Hellcat's technical specifications. We invite you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this compelling video. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please feel free to share a comment about your origin and your thoughts on the subject matter discussed in the video. Post-war investigations, specifically combat ophthalmology studies, meticulously quantified the precise impact of this phenomenon. Research participants, tasked with identifying aircraft silhouettes positioned within a 30-degree arc of the simulated sun's location at equivalent altitudes, consistently demonstrated identification accuracy rates falling below 8%. Shifting the target aircraft to a 45-degree angular separation from the sun dramatically elevated accuracy to 43%. At 60 degrees or more away from the sun, identification accuracy soared to an impressive 89%. The critical distinction between survival and demise in an aerial dogfight was, quite literally, a matter of mere angular degrees of separation from the blinding solar disk. American pilots during the early months of 1944 were empirically discovering this crucial insight through the crucible of combat. When an aviator skillfully positioned himself correctly in relation to the sun, he effectively became an invisible entity. Conversely, an incorrect positioning transformed him into an exposed target. From the Japanese perspective, there existed no viable countermeasure to this formidable tactic. It was fundamentally impossible to train human eyes to pierce through the intense solar glare at high altitudes. Furthermore, no tactical innovation could be devised that would effectively circumvent basic human biology. Although some highly experienced Japanese pilots attempted various alternative strategies, such as maintaining defensive weaving maneuvers during their ascent, assigning wingmen to scan disparate sections of the sky, or deliberately limiting their maximum operational altitude to remain beneath the perceived killing zone, none of these approaches yielded consistent or reliable success. The wingman, tasked with scanning a different sky section, was likewise incapable of effectively scrutinizing the sun quadrant, owing to the identical physiological limitations. Defensive weaving while climbing inevitably dissipated precious energy and significantly hampered the rate of ascent. Deliberately restricting altitude meant a complete forfeiture of the crucial vertical advantage. The American forces had therefore uncovered a combat methodology that ruthlessly exploited an insurmountable human vulnerability. Every Japanese pilot possessed the same optical systems with the same inherent limitations, and the sun's radiant intensity shone equally upon every aircraft operating within the vast Pacific theater. On June 19, 1944, the expansive Philippine Sea lay deceptively tranquil, a canvas of empty blue beneath the intense tropical sun. However, the radar screens aboard American vessels painted an entirely different, more ominous picture. Vice Admiral Mark Machere's formidable Task Force 58 had spent the entire morning in eager anticipation of this precise moment. Japanese land-based aircraft, launching in successive waves from airfields on Guam, Rota, and Tinian, were initiating what constituted the most extensive, coordinated aerial offensive the Imperial Japanese Navy had dared to attempt since the pivotal Battle of Midway. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was, in effect, committing every available asset. The ongoing American invasion of Saipan posed a direct and existential threat to Japan's inner defensive perimeter should he fail to halt the advance of the colossal invasion fleet. The conflict would undeniably transition into its conclusive phase. Japanese strategists were banking heavily on the superior operational range of their aircraft and the element of overwhelming numerical surprise. They were deploying a staggering 373 aircraft in multiple successive waves, fully expecting to utterly inundate American defenses through sheer numerical superiority. What remained unknown to them was that Task Force 58 had meticulously positioned 450 Hellcats in a sophisticated, layered defensive arrangement, and every single squadron commander had wholeheartedly adopted McCampbell's innovative altitude sun doctrine. The combat air patrol was not uniformly distributed at a single medium altitude. Rather, it was vertically stacked with deliberate, calculated precision. Lower cap stations maintained orbits at 10,000 feet, designed to intercept any enemy aircraft that might penetrate the primary defenses. Middle stations held their positions at 18,000 feet. The most critical killer stations, manned by the most seasoned and proficient pilots, orbited at elevations ranging from 23,000 to 25,000 feet, strategically placed directly between the sun and the anticipated axis of the incoming threat. Fighter directors stationed aboard the American aircraft carriers had precisely calculated the sun's position for 10,000 to 36 hours, the exact moment the first Japanese aerial wave was expected to appear. The high cap stations were then expertly vectored to specific geographical coordinates that would place them squarely within the solar glare from the perspective of any approaching enemy aircraft. The initial Japanese wave materialized on radar screens at precisely 10,136 hours, 140 miles due west of the task force. A formidable formation of 71 aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Judies, and Gills, steadily ascending to their attack altitude as they rapidly diminished the intervening distance. The distinct voice of the fighter director crackled through the radio headsets of every Hellcat pilot. Vector 270, bogies inbound, Angels 18 and climbing. The lower and middle cap stations immediately executed turns to commence their interception maneuvers. The high stations, however, remained motionless for the moment. They were patiently biding their time. The Japanese formation continued its ascent, climbing through 16,000 feet, then 18,000 feet, relentlessly pressing its approach. They maintained a disciplined attack formation, which meant their primary focus was on preserving their relative positions within the formation and intently scanning ahead for the anticipated American fleet. They were fully aware that opposing fighters would be present. They were mentally prepared for a conventional horizontal engagement. What they were utterly unprepared for was the entirely silent, utterly unexpected descent of 48 Hellcats, plunging from an altitude of 25,000 feet, directly out of the blinding sun. Commander Charles Brewer skillfully spearheaded VF-15 Strike Division into this devastating bounce. His aircraft, in its precipitous dive, rapidly accelerated past 400 miles per hour. The Japanese formation lay a mere 4,000 feet below him, perfectly delineated as stark silhouettes against the expansive ocean. He could effortlessly distinguish individual aircraft types, readily identify the bombers clustered in the core of the formation, and select his specific target with unhurried precision. The Japanese pilots perceived absolutely nothing until Brewer's initial burst of gunfire spectacularly detonated the fuel tank of a Judy bomber at 19,000 feet. At that instant, the entire formation instantly dissolved into utter pandemonium. Hellcats seemed to materialize instantaneously from every direction, unleashing torrents of fire from multiple angles, scything through the Japanese formation with a velocity that rendered any form of counterattack or organized defense utterly impossible. The Japanese aviators desperately attempted to react, but their responses were sluggish and thoroughly disoriented, largely because they had never witnessed the developing threat. Some attempted to execute dive maneuvers to escape, however. The lower cap stations were strategically positioned beneath them, waiting. Others endeavored to climb back to a more advantageous altitude, yet the middle cap stations were perfectly positioned to intercept climbing aircraft. There was literally no escape route. The formation that had commenced with 71 aircraft suffered the catastrophic loss of 42 within the initial 8 minutes of the engagement. The second enemy wave was launched from Guam at 11:30 hours, comprising 130 aircraft. American fighter directors once again vectored the high-cap stations into their optimal positions at 24,000 feet, with the sun strategically behind them, patiently awaiting. The devastating pattern was meticulously replicated. The Japanese ascended to their attack altitude. The Hellcats descended in a ferocious dive from the solar glare. A staggering 97 Japanese aircraft were obliterated. The third wave, arriving at 13 hours with 47 aircraft, saw 31 destroyed. The fourth wave, at 14:30 hours, consisted of 82 aircraft attempting a coordinated assault from multiple vectors, resulting in the destruction of 63. By 16 hours, the aerial engagement that would subsequently be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was effectively concluded. Japanese commanders ceased launching further strike missions simply because they had exhausted their available aircraft and, crucially, their skilled pilots. The final grim accounting revealed 350 Japanese aircraft annihilated. American losses, by stark contrast, amounted to a mere 29 Hellcats. While the raw kill ratio stood at an impressive 12:1, that numerical figure alone failed to fully encapsulate the overwhelming totality of the tactical triumph. A significant portion of those 29 American losses occurred during low-altitude skirmishes or were attributable to operational mishaps, rather than Japanese pilots achieving genuine air superiority. Within the high-altitude bounces, those engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed their sun-altitude positioning strategy, the kill ratio approached an astonishing 30:1. Post-battle interrogations of surviving Japanese pilots unveiled a profound and pervasive sense of demoralization. Numerous aviators recounted the identical harrowing experience, ascending to intercept, diligently scanning for any signs of threat, yet perceiving absolutely nothing. Then, without warning, their wingman would be engulfed in flames and plummeting, and they still possessed no comprehension of the attack's origin. One captured pilot's poignant statement, translated from his debriefing, succinctly articulated their bewilderment. We could not find them. We looked everywhere. Then they were shooting us. How do you fight what you cannot see? The Great Mariana's turkey shoot transcended a mere tactical victory. It represented a profound doctrinal revolution, disseminated with astonishing rapidity for a military bureaucracy. In this particular instance, the transmission occurred with remarkable speed. Within a mere 72 hours of the engagement, Vice Admiral Mitcher's staff produced a preliminary tactical bulletin that was immediately distributed to every carrier air group operating within the Pacific Fleet. The bulletin's central message was brutally unambiguous. Altitude sun positioning was now to be considered mandatory doctrine for all future fighter operations. It was not merely suggested, nor was it an experimental proposal. It was an absolute imperative. The bulletin further delineated specific operational protocols, minimum patrol altitudes of 20,000 feet whenever fuel reserves permitted, mandatory calculations for positioning that placed the sun within a 30-degree arc directly behind the cap station, and standardized communication procedures for coordinating high-altitude bounces. Every squadron commander received explicit orders to implement these procedures without delay. The implementation of these new operational guidelines was immediate and decisive. Initially, some squadron commanders expressed considerable resistance, especially those whose units had not been directly involved in the recent Philippine Sea engagement. Their objections often followed well-established logistical and physiological concerns. For instance, operating at a heightened altitude of 25,000 feet was projected to diminish patrol endurance by approximately 20% due to the significantly increased rate of fuel consumption. Furthermore, pilots frequently reported experiencing severe fatigue and intense cold during prolonged patrols at these extreme altitudes. The risk of oxygen system malfunctions also escalated dramatically when operating near an aircraft's altitude ceiling, transforming minor issues into potentially fatal emergencies. These were, without a doubt, valid and serious concerns. However, Admiral Mitcher's dedicated staff meticulously addressed each of these points, relying on irrefutable data rather than outright dismissal. They acknowledged the increased fuel consumption, but counter-argued that the overall mission effectiveness saw a 6-fold improvement. Similarly, while pilot discomfort was a legitimate issue, statistical evidence demonstrated an 85% enhancement in pilot survival rates. Regarding the critical nature of oxygen systems, the solution was not to abandon the strategy, but to institute more stringent pre-flight inspections and mandate the carrying of redundant backup systems. The mathematical evidence was unequivocal. Every single objection raised by the dissenting commanders primarily centered on issues of inconvenience or marginal increases in operational complexity, whereas the newly proposed doctrine promised an overwhelming and decisive increase in combat lethality. We hope you are finding this insightful. Please stay with us to watch the end of the video. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Also, feel free to share in the comments where you are from and what your thoughts are on this crucial aspect of aerial warfare. By August 1944, a profound transformation had swept through the Pacific Fleet. Every single fleet carrier and light carrier had completely reconfigured its fighter operations to align with the innovative altitude sun doctrine. This shift necessitated a fundamental overhaul of training protocols. aspiring new pilots arriving at replacement squadrons stationed in Pearl Harbor no longer dedicated the bulk of their advanced training to traditional dogfighting maneuvers, which had long been considered the pinnacle of aerial combat. Instead, their curriculum now heavily emphasized critical skills such as altitude energy management, precise sun angle calculations, and the execution of high-speed diving attacks. This revised curriculum was a direct reflection of the harsh realities of the battlefield. There was no longer a need to outmaneuver a Japanese Zero in a protracted turning fight, if one could eliminate it before its pilot even became aware of the threat. The paramount skills that truly mattered were rigorous climb discipline, maintaining formation integrity at extreme altitudes, accurate target identification from an advantageous position 4,000 feet above the adversary, and impeccable gunnery accuracy during lightning-fast diving attacks. All other skills, while not entirely discarded, were relegated to a secondary status. Lieutenant Alex Vasu, a distinguished pilot from VF-16, rapidly emerged as one of the doctrine's most exemplary and effective practitioners. During the intense Second Battle of the Philippine Sea, which unfolded on October 24, 1944, his division masterfully intercepted a Japanese strike group, employing textbook altitude sun positioning with chilling precision. Vasu's subsequent combat report meticulously detailed the engagement with a remarkable degree of technical accuracy. He recounted, established cap at 24,000 FT with sun bearing 280 degree relative. Bogies appeared at Angel 17 bearing 315 degrees, range 22 miles. Executed diving attack from 25,000 FT, achieving 430 knots, indicated airspeed. First burst at 19,500 FT, destroyed lead bomber. Second burst at 18,800 FT, destroyed second bomber. Pulled out at 16,000 FT, climbed back to 23,000 FT. Repositioned with sun behind me. Repeated attack sequence. In a breathtaking display of aerial prowess, Vasu shot down 6 enemy aircraft within an astonishing 8-minute span, executing multiple bounces from his unassailable altitude advantage. The Japanese forces were rendered utterly incapable of mounting an effective defense, primarily because they never achieved visual contact with their attackers before the devastating assaults were already well underway. The profound impact of this innovative doctrine extended far beyond the confines of carrier operations. Marine Corps fighter squadrons, strategically operating from recently captured island bases, swiftly adopted identical tactical approaches. Major Robert Gaylor, who commanded VMF 224 on Majuro Atoll, consistently positioned his Corsairs at a commanding altitude of 22,000 feet during defensive patrols. When Japanese bombers approached the island at a comparatively lower altitude of 16,000 feet, Gaylor's skilled fighters would plunge from the sun, obliterating the enemy before they could even reach their designated bomb release points. Even Army Air Force P-38 squadrons operating in the Southwest Pacific, having heard of the Navy's resounding success, began to experiment with similar positioning strategies. The outcomes were remarkably consistent across a diverse array of aircraft types and various operational theaters. The combination of superior altitude and advantageous solar positioning consistently resulted in an invisible approach, which in turn led to catastrophic surprise for the enemy. Japanese intelligence officers diligently attempted to analyze and comprehend this significant tactical shift. Captured documents from late 1944 reveal a clear understanding of the unfolding situation. One tactical assessment, translated after the war, explicitly stated, American fighters consistently attack from high altitude with the sun behind them. Our pilots report inability to detect threats until attacks are underway. recommend increased vigilance in sun quadrant and higher patrol altitudes. However, merely understanding the problem did not inherently provide a viable solution. Japanese pilots were simply unable to patrol effectively at 27,000 feet because their aircraft were not designed to perform optimally at such extreme altitudes. Furthermore, they could not effectively see into the blinding sun quadrant, regardless of their vigilance, simply because human eyes are not physiologically capable of doing so. The recommendations, while tactically sound in theory, proved practically impossible to implement. By October 1944, the doctrinal gap had become insurmountable. American fighters had firmly established their dominance of the altitude, claimed ownership of the sun, and consequently seized the initiative in every single engagement. The Japanese forces were by no means unintelligent, nor were their pilots lacking in courage. By late 1944, their seasoned veteran pilots possessed a clear and painful understanding of precisely what was causing their heavy losses. Captured tactical directives from November 1944 vividly illustrate Japanese air commanders desperately attempting to devise systematic countertactics to address the pervasive altitude sun problem. Their initial approach involved significant formation modifications. Instead of adhering to their standard 3-aircraft Shotai formations, Japanese squadrons began experimenting with spread-out defensive arrays, where individual aircraft maintained a vertical separation of 2,000 feet. The theoretical underpinning of this strategy was sound if American fighters initiated their bounces from 25,000 feet. Having their own aircraft staggered between 14,000, 16,000, and 18,000 feet should, in principle, provide mutual warning and support. The uppermost aircraft might potentially spot the diving attackers in sufficient time to alert the lower elements. However, in practical application, this dispersed spacing severely compromised formation cohesion, rendering the entire group highly vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, recognized as one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds and a key planner of the Pearl Harbor strike, proposed a distinct solution in December 1944. His innovative concept centered on the use of sacrifice aircraft, dedicated spotters whose sole mission was to fly approximately 3,000 feet above the main formation. These spotters were tasked with continuously scanning the sun quadrant through heavily tinted goggles. Critically, these spotters were not to engage in combat. They were not to maneuver. Their singular purpose was to vigilantly observe the killing zone and radio warnings when they detected incoming Hellcats. Several squadrons attempted to implement Genda's spotter concept during operations over Luzon in January 1945. The results, while marginally better than previous disastrous outcomes, still translated to catastrophic rather than apocalyptic losses. Occasionally, the spotters did manage to detect diving Hellcats early enough to provide a fleeting 3 or 4 seconds of warning. However, 3 seconds proved to be woefully insufficient. By the time the spotter relayed the warning, processed the information, and the main formation attempted to react, the Hellcats were already actively firing their weapons. Worse still, the spotters themselves quickly became priority targets. American pilots swiftly learned to identify these high-flying, solitary aircraft and eliminate them first, thereby entirely nullifying any potential early warning. Some exceptionally experienced Japanese aces devised individual solutions to this daunting problem. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, already a legendary figure for surviving combat wounds that would have proven fatal to most pilots, developed a unique tactical scanning pattern that partially mitigated the debilitating effects of solar glare. He meticulously avoided looking directly at the sun, instead systematically scanning the surrounding space in specific quadrants, utilizing his peripheral vision to detect any movement. Peripheral vision, relying on rod cells rather than cone cells, possesses a slightly enhanced function in conditions of high glare. Sakai's method proved effective for him, with his continued survival through 1944 and into 1945, serving as testament to its efficacy. However, this technique demanded extraordinary discipline, years of combat experience, and exceptional situational awareness. It was simply not teachable to the average pilot within the severely compressed training timelines that Japan faced in 1945. Most replacement pilots arriving at operational squadrons possessed a mere 100 total flight hours. They could barely maintain formation, let alone execute Sakai's advanced visual techniques, while simultaneously managing their aircraft and maintaining comprehensive combat awareness. The Japanese also experimented with imposing time-of-day restrictions on their missions. If the sun was the root of the problem, the logical conclusion was to avoid flying when its position favored American attackers. Several air groups implemented policies that restricted missions to either early morning or late afternoon, times when the sun was lower on the horizon. However, this created a new set of problems. Early morning missions often meant aircraft launched before optimal weather reconnaissance could be completed, and late afternoon missions drastically compressed the operational window, leaving no margin for unexpected delays. American fighter directors adapted almost instantaneously. They simply repositioned their combat air patrol TUACSAP stations to ensure the sun remained behind them, regardless of the specific time of day. If a Japanese attack was launched at 06:30 hours with the sun rising in the east, American fighters would strategically position themselves to the east at altitude. Conversely, if an attack occurred at 17:30 hours with the sun setting in the west, they would position themselves to the west. The sun's absolute position changed, but the critical relative geometry remained constant. The Americans steadfastly maintained their decisive advantage. December 1944 witnessed the deployment of the most desperate counter-tactic, aggressive low-altitude attacks. The logic was simple. If survival at medium and high altitudes was impossible, then the solution was to attack from the deck. Japanese strike groups began approaching their targets at altitudes of 500 feet or even lower, hoping to evade radar detection and deny American fighters the crucial altitude advantage necessary for their bouncing attacks. This tactic occasionally succeeded against isolated targets, but it proved to be nothing short of suicide when employed against the concentrated defenses surrounding American carrier task forces. Flying at 500 feet meant that Japanese aircraft were visually detectable by destroyers and picket ships as far as 15 miles out. These ships would immediately radio their position, heading, and composition. Consequently, American Hellcats no longer needed to maintain high cap stations. They would simply climb to 15,000 feet directly above the projected enemy course and patiently wait for the Japanese aircraft to fly underneath them. They would then dive down onto aircraft that had virtually nowhere to go except into the unforgiving ocean. Moreover, low-altitude attacks severely negated the Japanese aircraft's inherent range advantage because flying at such low altitudes consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. Zeros and Kates that could typically reach targets 300 miles away at altitude would often run out of fuel after only 180 miles at sea level. 180 miles at sea level. By February of 1945, the various methods devised to counteract the American aerial dominance had utterly failed. Japanese aviation units were compelled to resort to kamikaze assaults, not primarily due to deeply held ideological convictions, but rather because conventional tactical offensive maneuvers had become utterly unfeasible. If a pilot could not survive for a sufficient duration to execute a precise bombing run, then intentionally crashing their aircraft into the designated target became the sole viable strategy to guarantee that the mission inflicted any meaningful damage. This stark reality represented a complete and unambiguous acknowledgement of total failure in air combat. The altitude sun doctrine had not merely established American air superiority, it had systematically eradicated Japan's capacity to challenge control of the airspace through traditional fighter tactics. The conclusive statistical evidence narrates a profound story that transcends individual pilot aptitude or sheer bravery. From the period spanning June 1944 through August 1945, Hellcat aviators achieved an extraordinary overall kill ratio of 19:1 against all categories of Japanese aircraft, signifying that 19 Japanese planes were destroyed for every single Hellcat lost. This comprehensive figure encompasses every type of engagement. The impeccably executed surprise attacks from above, descending from the sun's blinding glare, the chaotic low-altitude dogfights, the unfortunate operational mishaps, and losses incurred from ground fire, among all other scenarios. When the analysis is confined exclusively to those engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed altitude sun positioning, strictly adhering to the established doctrine, the ratio escalates dramatically to an astonishing 26:1. These are not mere estimations or figures propagated for propaganda purposes. They are meticulously compiled from authenticated gun camera footage, detailed aircraft action reports, and confirmed wreckage tallies, which were subsequently cross-referenced with Japanese loss records recovered following the cessation of hostilities. David McCampbell concluded the war as the Navy's preeminent ace with 34 confirmed aerial victories. Alex Vesu registered 19 kills, as did Patrick Fleming. Cecil Harris amassed 24. This impressive roster extends to hundreds of pilots who attained ace status, defined as 5 or more kills throughout 1944 and 1945. What truly stands out is not merely that exceptional individual pilots achieved such high scores. What is truly remarkable is the sheer number of ordinary average pilots who not only survive but also achieve significant success by rigorously applying this doctrine. Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Baker, serving with VF-27, was by no means a naturally gifted fighter pilot. His instructors at Pensacola assessed him as merely adequate in gunnery skills and noted that he required considerable improvement in combat maneuvering techniques. Yet Baker diligently mastered the altitude sun positioning strategy, adhered to the doctrine with unwavering discipline, and concluded the war with 7 confirmed kills and, remarkably, 0 losses from his entire division. This particular tactic transformed competent yet unremarkable pilots into highly effective combatants because it systematically eliminated most of the unpredictable variables that typically differentiated truly exceptional pilots from their average counterparts. The doctrine's profound effectiveness was even more dramatically evident in pilot survival statistics than in the impressive kill ratios. In 1943, prior to the widespread adoption of altitude sun positioning as a standard operational procedure, the typical carrier fighter pilot could expect to survive an average of 3.8 combat engagements before being either killed or seriously wounded. By late 1944, that critical number had dramatically increased to 14.2 engagements. Pilots were surviving for considerably longer periods, which inherently meant they were accumulating invaluable combat experience, thereby becoming progressively more lethal to the enemy in a self-reinforcing compounding cycle. Japanese pilot survival, conversely, moved in the exact opposite direction. In 1943, an average Japanese fighter pilot managed to survive 6.1 engagements. By late 1944, that number had plummeted to a mere 2.3. Japan was hemorrhaging its experienced pilots at a rate far exceeding their capacity to train replacements, and these new recruits were perishing before they could even gain any meaningful combat experience. This tactical asymmetry inexorably created a catastrophic death spiral for Japanese naval aviation. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Consider the profound implications of this situation in practical, operational terms. During the pivotal Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed nearly 200 carrier and land-based aircraft to launch assaults against American forces. American combat air patrols, strategically positioned at high altitudes, obliterated 173 of these aircraft over 2 intense days of fighting. The American losses totaled a mere 16 aircraft. Of those 16, only 7 were actually lost due to direct enemy action. The remaining 9 were attributed to operational incidents. One pilot was forced to ditch his aircraft due to critical fuel exhaustion. 3 aircraft crashed during challenging carrier landings. 5 suffered severe mechanical failures. The Japanese were not merely being defeated, they were being annihilated with such thoroughness that more American aircraft were lost to accidents than to actual combat. This is the unmistakable hallmark of absolute air superiority. Your operational losses consistently surpass your combat losses because the enemy simply lacks the capability to effectively fight back. The enduring legacy of the altitude sun doctrine extends far beyond the confines of World War II. During the Korean War, fighter pilots employed virtually identical tactics when engaging formidable MiG-15s. In the Vietnam War era, F-4 Phantom crews frequently utilized the sun to gain a crucial positioning advantage during their encounters with North Vietnamese MiGs. Indeed, modern fighter doctrine continues to place significant emphasis on maintaining an energy advantage and executing attacks from the enemy's inherent blind spots. Although advanced radar and sophisticated missile technology have undeniably transformed the specific methods of implementation, the fundamental principle remains universally valid. Strategically position yourself where enemy sensors cannot effectively detect you, and then launch an attack with overwhelming speed and complete surprise. Every comprehensive air combat manual written since 1945 incorporates altitude energy management and solar positioning as foundational core concepts. The ingenious tactics that Hellcat pilots meticulously developed through arduous trial and invaluable experience in 1944 ultimately became the bedrock doctrine for 3 subsequent generations of fighter pilots. There is an almost inherently unfair quality to how this particular tactic functions. Japanese pilots in 1944 and 1945 frequently displayed bravery bordering on fanaticism. They were unequivocally willing to sacrifice their lives for the successful completion of their missions. They relentlessly pressed their attacks against seemingly insurmountable odds. Their courage was beyond question. However, courage alone could not defy the immutable laws of physics. Bravery did not grant eyes the ability to penetrate the blinding solar glare at 20,000 feet. Sheer determination could not magically add 2,000 feet per minute to an aircraft's climb rate. The altitude sun doctrine masterfully exploited unchangeable physical and biological realities. It was not that Japanese pilots were not exerting sufficient effort. It was that they were engaged in combat against an adversary they literally could not perceive until it was tragically too late. The Hellcat pilots were not inherently superior human beings. They were human beings who had simply learned to ingeniously weaponize the sun and gravity against opponents who possessed no effective counter to either force. That precisely was the pivotal distinction between fighting harder and fighting smarter. The Japanese opted for the former approach. The Americans, through their ingenuity, discovered the latter. The kill ratios reflected that critical distinction with stark mathematical precision: 19:1. The numbers were irrefutable, and they held no regard for courage. They were exclusively concerned with altitude, the blinding power of sunlight, and the 400 mph of speed you commanded when you executed a devastating dive from the sun's glare. I am writing from the United States, and I find the video topic incredibly insightful, highlighting how strategic thinking and understanding physical principles can outweigh sheer bravery or individual skill in combat. It's a powerful reminder that innovation and adaptation are crucial, even in the most desperate circumstances.